do that. There we go. So we're recording. Welcome to week 5. So ethics. So we're moving here kind of into more practical concerns, like, how should people behave? And actually, all 3 of these next weeks are circling around that kind of some aspect of a question of how ought people behave or how ought people live their lives. Existentialism is going to be kind of like, well, what about how do I live my life as an individual? And politics is very much about how do we live our lives together. So the modern world, start with, once we have kind of systems of trade with mercantilism and then capitalism in the 16th, 17th centuries, it starts to become more and more important to answer questions with specifics. And the older way of thinking about being a good person that we inherit from the Greeks and then from the early Middle Ages focuses on the question of virtue, which is an interesting idea about right and wrong, but it's not the kind of approach that gives you immediate answers. It tends to give you longer term answers, like find an ethical person, follow them around and watch how they behave, which is really kind of, in the end, Aristotle's teaching about how to be the best way to become an ethical person: find a virtuous person, follow that person around, see what they do. So at any rate, so the ancient world has this idea that right and wrong is a matter of character, and character is really a matter of character development. It's sort of a matter of choosing to be the kind of person that does good things over time, and that makes you a good person. And so a good person doesn't ask themselves day to day or moment to moment, what should I do? It's just sort of they are intuiting it as they go along. So it's not really a matter of minute by minute analysis, which is, of course, that becomes the problem for time frames that need to collapse. We want something that does minute to minute ethics. But anyway, we start with, well, it's being a virtuous person. So I managed to find a few little introductory videos for all of these things. And with Aristotle, I wanted to focus a bit more on what he thinks virtues are, but we can start with the little video that I found to introduce it. And for the sake of the future, anyone who might want to watch the recording of this, I've discovered with great frustration that Zoom is not recording the screen. It's recording whoever's speaking. And so as long as I'm speaking, it records me, it doesn't record the screen. So unfortunately, it might capture the video, but you won't be able to see it might capture the audio, but you won't be able to see the video on a recording. Anyway, let's see what we can do here. Make that smaller. Okay, so Nico, I found a couple of videos, so now I'm forgetting if this one includes this little tidbit, but to start with, I guess it's worth mentioning, Nicomachus was Aristotle's father's name and Aristotle's son's name. So Nicomachean here is a reference to his son, and his son was a student of his at the Lyceum, and he wrote down lecture notes as his father was teaching. And so the book that we call Nicomachean Ethics is actually Aristotle's son's lecture notes from his father's lectures, which I think as a parent, that's really cute. But it also sort of highlights a little detail here, which is we don't have books that Aristotle seems to have written. Most of what we have are things that people wrote about what Aristotle said. So all of the ethics are that way. And I think a lot of the politics, and I think some of the metaphysics might be in his own hand, but it's hard to determine some of that. And I think, but anyway, the relying a lot on lecture notes. And this, interestingly, is not entirely unusual. There are some important cases, even with more modern philosophers, where some really interesting books that we attribute to them are not really books they wrote. They're books students of theirs wrote listening to lectures that were being given. So this sets a tradition in philosophy to do this. Anyway, so the Nicomachean Ethics are in these little books, which he calls books, we call chapters. And they all focus on a little bit sort of different aspect of how he thinks about ethics. So this goes over a summary of the whole book, and then we'll go back and talk about virtues and how to understand them.
Nicomachean Ethics is divided into 10 books. In book 1, Aristotle wants to find the highest human good for individuals and communities. Everyone seeks happiness, which is commonly believed to be humans' highest goal or ultimate good, but the only way to achieve it is to acquire virtue or excellent character. Humans should cultivate a virtuous life of reason, seeking the truth with the help of rational thought. In book 2, to be happy, people can strive for virtues of character. Aristotle also distinguishes between the state of virtue and the actions of the virtuous person. Many virtues are mean or intermediate states between an excess or a deficiency of a character trait. In books 3 and 4, right actions help people achieve virtuous states. People make good decisions through deliberation. People have the power to choose virtue or vice, but they must start with the correct internal principles. Aristotle discusses various virtues and perfecting them. In book 5, virtue in a political community takes the form of justice. Humans and communities can both achieve the state of justice through their actions. Laws and principles of fairness can bring justice to a society with good rulers. Aristotle distinguishes between different types of justice and injustice. In book 6, Aristotle explores virtues of thought, which come from the rational or reasoning part of the soul. He examines the relationship between thought, action, and decision. The most significant virtues of thought are wisdom, understanding, and prudence. In book 7, Aristotle distinguishes vice from the condition of incontinence or lack of restraint in pursuing physical desires, examines how incontinence can be caused, and compares and contrasts incontinence with intemperance. He also discusses good, moderate approaches to pleasure. Books 8 and 9 show how friendships contribute to a good life. The most lasting friendships will be based on virtue. Incomplete friendships, or those based on utility or pleasure, have their own merits and drawbacks. In book 10, Aristotle returns to the role of pleasure and happiness. The highest good, which leads to the happiest life, is study in the pursuit of wisdom. Study and understanding allow humans to approach the state of the divine. Aristotle concludes by asserting the importance of moral education for happiness and introduces his political treatise, Politics, which will explore different systems of law.
Okay, so there's a school of thought that might be a little bit elitist. The highest form of the good is study. Yeah. So anyway, ask an intellectual about the highest good. What are you going to get?
Wait, there are some people who think studying something is not a good thing.
But the highest good.
Oh, okay. Okay, that is a distinction. Oh.
Yeah. So, okay, right now, the bit here that I want, the takeaway for you all, from the handout, I in parentheses, after virtue ethics, I have this word arete, which is how you say that, at least I think that's how you say it, arete, which is the Greek word for virtue. And so sometimes, so people will refer to Aristotle's theory as virtue ethics, and then there's a whole body of literature that uses the adjective aretaic ethics. So for the Greek, so if you hear that arete, it's just the Greek word for virtue. Now the important, as I mentioned, this is a common idea in the ancient world that virtue is a standard for thinking about good and bad behavior. What Aristotle's really done here is to organize this around the concept of a golden mean, that's his important bit. What is a virtue is a mean between two identifiable extremes, and that's how we know it, is because we can know the extremes, so we can also know the mean as a result. So, and he goes through 10 of them. So high-mindedness, the too little of that is humbleness, so which he means is sort of too overly humble, and too much of it, vainglory, vanity, which really works for us. Right ambition, number 2. So too little, no ambition. Too much, too ambitious, overly ambitious. good temper. He has spiritlessness, sort of not responding to the world, and irascibility, sort of being sort of overly critical and difficult. Then civility, and too little is being rude, and too much is being obsequious. Courage, which is really the example that gets discussed the most. It's probably because it's an easy one for teenagers to get a hold of. That if you're they're going to get this, that if you're cowardly, that's too little, but you can also be rash, and that's too much. And so being courageous is actually somewhere in between, that you're not doing too much of it. So I think that's always the one we use with the students. Self-control, we have insensibility on one side and intemperance on the other. Sincerity, of sarcasm on one side, boastfulness on the other. Wit, which I think is kind of interesting that he includes that as a virtue. But remember, right, his point in asking the question, he's asking this very holistic question about, really, it starts with what is a good life? And this is just for him part of the answer to the question of what is a good life. And so it's interesting that he includes things like this. So wit, so too little, you're boorish, too much, you're a buffoon. Modesty, which makes sense, it would be here. Shameless and overly shy. Just resentment, which is an interesting one. That often gets translated as righteous. Right, it's right, kind of like righteous indignation. I'm not sure if I've really seen people translate it that way or just example that way. Anyway, you think about it, that what he's saying is, when bad things happen, you should notice, and you should protest that. So just resentment. So too little, you're callous because you're not noticing. Too much, you just end up spiteful. Generosity. So you could either too little, you're petty, too much, you're being vulgar. Liberality, which I think he means sort of, by which he means you're engaging with, being willing to share yourself with people. And too little is just sort of being mean, because and too much is wastefulness. Uh-oh. Noises on my end, sorry about that. Okay, that make how is it, is that pretty clear? I mean, I think, and again, his answer was for how do I go about becoming virtuous, was find a virtuous person, follow them around. So this master-student relationship, very common in the ancient world in a lot of different ways, a lot of different formats. So here, just another example of that kind of master-student relationship.
It's like mentorship, isn't it? Our modern equivalent.
Mm-hmm. That would be that'd be a good word for it too. Yeah. So it's just that. So again, this is a way of answering the question in a being a good person in a general way, but it's not giving precision on specific questions, which the modern world found more and more that it wanted. And so we turn more and more in modern thinking, although there has been a resurgence of interest in virtue in the last couple of decades. Really started, I think, 30 years ago now, maybe, with a book by an important philosopher, a British guy named Alistair MacIntyre. And he might have passed away by now, but he had this interesting habit of writing a big book about every 10 years in which he kind of remade himself. It was not having kind of one program he's pursuing over the course of his life, but he has a number of interesting books along the way in which he kind of rethinks where he's going. And anyway, so he has this book called After Virtue that tried to argue for reintroducing virtue into kind of modern ethical thought. And that bore fruit. I think it really took like a couple of decades, but there started to be sort of more papers being written on that kind of thing, and a little bit more interest in looking back at the ancient world, including a lot of Roman thought as well, the Stoics and Epicureans. And so these those kinds of groups in the ancient world were all founded around communities that had their own ideas really about what is a virtuous life. So anyway, so there's lots of different schools of thought to look at in the ancient world when you're going back to virtue as an idea to try to bring out. At any rate, but it's still, there's this push on more immediate decision making that we need. So as we bring ethics into modern kind of philosophical discourse, then what I want you to see too is it fits into this kind of systematic way of thinking that I've been trying to point out to you all. So on the one hand, there's going to be ethics that follows sometimes directly, and we'll see sometimes loosely, but will follow that idealist metaphysical thought. And then there's another system of ethics that's going to follow materialist metaphysics in a systematic way. So what that would mean, if you sort of thinking about it, right, the idealist side is interested in things like essences, and that in terms of thinking about right and wrong, that an essence comes in ethics in the form of principles. So there is this essence to right and wrong, which is expressed in principles of right and wrong. And the general name for that line of thought is called deontological ethics. Now, this word is a little confusing because of the spelling, unfortunately. So when you see deontological, and even when you say it, you're probably thinking ontological. And remember, I introduced that word ontological. It means the study of being, from the Greek word ontos, ontological. However, this is not actually the word that's being used here. The root here is the word deon, not ontos. So deontological, but that's just harder to say. And so when we say it in English, it sounds like we're saying deontological, but it really should be deontological. So deon, sort of from principles here. Okay, so that principle-based ethics, fancy word, deontological. Other side of it is going to be consequences. How do I measure it? I measure it in my experience. So ethics is going to be about measuring experiences. So we call that consequentialist. So consequences. And then there's another word that's used sometimes for that line of, well, no, there are two other important words. One general word, which is teleological. So that way of thinking is about an end, telos, an end. We talked a little bit about that I think, the idea of end. So anyway, telos. So you're looking at the end of the end result is the idea when someone says teleological. And then John Stuart Mill, who's really following an older philosopher who's actually a friend of his father. His father was James Mill, was also an important philosopher. And James Mill had a friend named Jeremy Bentham. Bentham wrote a book called Utilitarianism, and that becomes the name that the English philosophers use for their version of consequentialist or teleological ethics, so utilitarian. So what that gives us for specifics is there's going to be Kantian ethics and there's going to be utilitarian ethics. And Kantian ethics are deontological and utilitarian ethics are consequentialist or teleological. Okay. So with that sort of little introduction, let me show you have a little video about Kant too.
Richard,
huh?
What was the name of the one who wrote a book about every 10 years? And
that was Alistair McIntyre.
okay, thanks.
Okay, so here we go.
Philosophy is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace, share your passion with the world. I don't know if you've noticed this, but all of our discussions about ethics so far have had one thing in common: God. Divine command theory, for example, argues that what's good and what's not are determined by a deity, whether that's the God of Abraham or a panoply of gods who come up with ethical rules by committee. And the theory of natural law, as advanced by Thomas Aquinas, says that morality comes from us, but only because we were made by God, who preloaded us with moral sensibilities. But many other thinkers have argued that humanity's moral code doesn't come from some supernatural force. 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant, for one, thought that religion and morality were a terrible pairing, and if anything, the two should be kept apart. Instead, Kant argued, in order to determine what's right, you have to use reason and a sense of consideration for other people, and, at least the way I'm teaching it today, chom-choms. Kant took morality pretty seriously, and he thought we should too, all of us, regardless of our religious beliefs or lack thereof. Because he knew that if we look to religion for our morality, we're not all going to get the same answer. But he thought morality was a constant in an almost mathematical sense. 2 + 2 = 4, whether you're a Christian, Buddhist, or atheist. And for Kant, the same went for moral truths. But he made a distinction between the things we ought to do morally and the things we ought to do for other non-moral reasons. He pointed out that most of the time, whether or not we ought to do something isn't really a moral choice. Instead, it's just contingent on our desires. Like, if your desire is to get money, then you ought to get a job. If your desire is to get an A in class, then you ought to study. Kant called these if-then statements hypothetical imperatives. They're commands that you should follow if you want something. But hypothetical imperatives are about prudence rather than morality. So if you don't want money, you can always choose not to work. And if you don't care about getting a good grade, studying becomes totally optional. It'd be a terrible option, in my opinion, as an educator, but still optional. But Kant viewed morality not in terms of hypothetical imperatives, but through what he called categorical imperatives. These are commands you must follow regardless of your desires. Categorical imperatives are our moral obligations, and Kant believed that they're derived from pure reason. He said it doesn't matter whether you want to be moral or not. The moral law is binding on all of us. And he said you don't need religion to determine what that law is, because what's right and wrong is totally knowable just by using your intellect. Okay, so how do you figure out what's moral? Kant said the categorical imperative can be understood in terms of various formulations, basically different ways of phrasing or looking at the same essential idea. And he came up with 4 formulations of the categorical imperative. Let me tell you about the 2 most popular ones. The first formulation of the categorical imperative is often known as the universalizability principle. And Kant phrased it this way: act only according to that maxim, which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law without contradiction. Okay, Kant, pretty wordy guy, so let's unpack what he was saying. A maxim is just a rule or principle of action, and a universal law is something that must always be done in similar situations. So, as a Kantian, before I act, I would ask myself, what's the maxim of my action? In other words, what's the general rule that stands behind the particular action I'm considering? Let's say you forgot your wallet in your dorm this morning. You don't have time to get it between classes, and you're really hungry. You notice that the student working at the snack kiosk in the union is engrossed in a conversation, and you could easily snag a banana and be on your way. Sorry, chom-chom. I mean chom-chom. You could easily swipe that chom-chom and be on your way. Is it okay morally for you to do this? Well, the particular action you are considering, taking a chom-chom from a merchant without paying for it, is stealing. And if you approve of the maxim of stealing, which you're doing whether you admit it or not, then what you're actually doing is universalizing that action. You're saying that everyone should always steal. If you should be able to do it, then everyone should be able to do it. The thing is, this leads to a contradiction. And remember, Kant's wording specifically says that moral actions cannot bring about contradictions. The contradiction here is no one would say that everyone should steal all the time. Because if everyone should always steal, then you should steal the chom-chom, and then I should steal it back from you, and then you should steal it back from me, and it would never end, and no one would ever get to eat any chom-chom. Therefore, stealing isn't universalizable. So what Kant's really saying is that it's not fair to make exceptions for yourself. You don't really think stealing is okay, and by imagining what it would be like to universalize it, that becomes clear. Now, Kant's view that moral rules apply to everyone equally sounds nice and fair, but it can sometimes lead to some pretty counterintuitive results. To see how this formulation can go awry, let's visit the thought bubble for some flash philosophy. Let's say one morning Elvira and Tony are having breakfast. Then a stranger comes to the door and asks where Tony is so he can kill him. Obviously, Elvira's in.
Now, and this was mentioning, Kant did write about this. It's an afterword to his very last book, and it's called On the Supposed Right to Lie. The shorthand we use for it to talk about it now is we call it the murderer at the door problem, and it's a problem.
Impulse is to lie and say that Tony isn't around right now in order to protect him from this would-be murderer. But Kant says she can't lie, not ever, not even to save Tony's life. Here's his reasoning. Suppose she's at the front door talking to the stranger. At the time, she thinks Tony's in the kitchen where she left him, but it turns out that he was curious about the caller, so he followed her into the living room and heard the stranger make his threats. Fearing for his life, Tony slipped out the back door. Meanwhile, Elvira, in her desire to save him, tells the stranger that Tony isn't there even though she thinks he is. Based on her lie, the stranger leaves and runs into Tony as he rounds the corner, heading away from the house, and kills him. Had she told the truth, the stranger might have headed into the kitchen looking for Tony, which would have given Tony time to escape. But she didn't. Now, by Kant's reasoning, Elvira is responsible for Tony's death because her lie caused it. Had she told the truth, only the murderer would have been responsible for any deaths that might have occurred. Now, she could have refused to answer the stranger altogether or tried to talk him out of it. But the one thing that she's never permitted to do is violate the moral law, even if others are doing so, even for a really good cause. Poor Tony. Very sad. But thanks, Thought Bubble. So the first formulation of the categorical imperative is about the universality of our actions. But the second formulation focuses on how we should treat other people. And it goes this way. Act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never as a mere means. Again, we have to define some terms here to figure out what this is all about. To use something as a mere means is to use it only for your own benefit with no thought to the interests or benefit of the thing you're using. Now, we use things as mere means all the time. I use this mug to hold my coffee, and if it were to stop benefiting me, like if it got a crack in it and it started leaking, I wouldn't use it anymore. It's perfectly fine to use things as mere means, but not humans. This is because we are what Kant called ends in ourselves. We are not mere objects that exist to be used by others. We are our own ends. We're rational and autonomous, and we have the ability to set our own goals and work toward them. Coffee mugs exist for coffee drinkers. Humans exist for themselves. So to treat someone as an end in herself means to recognize the humanity of the person you're encountering, to realize that she has goals, values, and interests of her own, and you must morally keep that in mind in your encounters with her. Now, Kant pointed out that we do use people all the time, and that's okay, because most of the time we use other people as a means for something, but not as a mere means. We still recognize their humanity when we use them, and they agree to being used. So, for example, you are using me right now to get information about Kantian ethics. I am using Nick and Nicole to help me get that information to you. Kant said that you and I and Nick and Nicole, we all deserve to not be used as mere means because of our autonomy. Unlike other things in the world, we're self-governed. We're able to set our own ends, to make our own free decisions based on our rational wills. We can set goals for ourselves and take steps to realize those goals. This imbues us with an absolute moral worth, Kant said, which means that we shouldn't be manipulated or manipulate other autonomous agents for our own benefit. And this means that things like lying and deception are never okay, because if I'm being deceived, I can't make an autonomous decision about how to act because my decision is based on false information. For instance, I might agree to loan you money so you can buy books for school, but I wouldn't agree to loan you money so that you can get a new Xbox. I'm sorry, but no. So when you lie to me about what you're going to be doing with the money you're asking for, you rob me of my ability to autonomously decide to help you. You've treated me as a mere means to accomplish your goals with no thought to my own goals and interests. And that's a violation of Kant's second categorical imperative. So Kant argued that proper rational application of the categorical imperative will lead us to moral truth that is fixed and applicable to all moral agents. No God required. Of course, not everyone agreed with him. So next time we're going to check out a theory that is in many ways.
Okay, that's where we are going next too. So I think there's I like with students, I use the example of a clerk in a store. This, so when you go to the store, you need to check out and buy whatever you're buying, and the clerk at the cash register there, you're using that person to accomplish what you want. the clerk in the store is there to take money from people, and that's sort of their job, and they're in essence using you to accomplish their job. But what makes that not mere means, and so Kant really means that extra mere very importantly there, is that you both know what you're doing. Is that you're both in the store understanding exactly what's going on, and no one is doing anything that the other person doesn't understand their motivations. The clerk knows that you want to pay for whatever you bought, and that's what you're there for, and you're not there to establish a relationship with the clerk, but you will hopefully be a friendly person and smile and say hi. And the clerk has the same understanding that they're just using you to accomplish the work of their day, but they, as a human being, they'll acknowledge your humanity along the way, and they understand we're all just doing this little interaction together because we need to. So that's okay, precisely because everybody involved knows what they're doing, and they're all doing it sort of freely, in some free sense. You can always argue the employee is sort of coerced to be there, but at any rate, in this sense, in the immediate sense, they're there knowing what they know what you're doing, you know what they're doing. And so this mere means is very important detail in there. It doesn't mean everyone in the world has to become your best friend. Just you need to acknowledge their humanity as you interact with them, even as a store clerk. Okay. Now, the bit here that ties to Kant's metaphysics, I just sort of want to point out, right, is that he puts this very heavy emphasis on reasoning, that I'm going to reason my way to such and such, and reason my way for such and such, and all of this is relying on very abstract principles. He's not appealing to anything in my day-to-day experience to make, beyond the fact that my day-to-day experience has motivated me to feel I should be an autonomous agent. But it all starts, it's all operating in a sphere in which what matters are important principles, and how those principles are relating. And one of the principles is I am a thinking thing. Okay, anybody have any questions here? Okay, pretty straightforward. So the alternative then is, well, maybe what's right and wrong depends on how I experience it. So we get to the utilitarians.
John Stuart Mill embraces a version of consequentialism called utilitarianism. So the right action maximizes happiness or pleasure when compared to other actions you might perform. Promoting happiness or pleasure is the ultimate goal of morality. But you might wonder if all forms of pleasure carry equal weight, or are some types of pleasure more valuable? This leads to the first idea for Mill. Idea number one is that intellectual pleasures are more valuable than pure physical pleasures. So Jeremy Bentham was a utilitarian that lived before Mill. Bentham thought of all pleasure being qualitatively similar, so all pleasure has roughly equal value in doing the utilitarian calculation to discover what's right or wrong. But Mill and others pointed out that this leads to an objection to utilitarianism, namely that it's suited best for like fat and happy swine. In response, Mill refines utilitarianism. He notes that intellectual pleasures are more valuable than pure physical pleasure. Solving a puzzle, playing chess, and writing a book are qualitatively better than just, say, eating chocolate cake, getting a massage, and smelling flowers. Though intellectual pleasures are often accompanied by toil and produce less immediate gratification, they're intrinsically more satisfying than fleeting physical pleasures. This leads Mill to the memorable quote from his book Utilitarianism, which I'll link to in the description. Quote, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." If you think it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, leave, quote, "examined life" in the comments below. Leave, quote, "happy pig" in the comments below if you think the reverse. Now, idea number two is that everyone's happiness counts equally. My happiness is not more important than yours. This makes sense. When you think about moral people from history, who comes to mind? Probably people like Gandhi, Jesus, and Mother Teresa. Why were they moral? They stood for others. They loved others well. This often came at the expense of their own happiness. They didn't value their own happiness above the happiness of others. When you think of immoral people from history, who comes to mind? Probably people like Hitler, Stalin, and serial killer like Ted Bundy. Why are they immoral? Well, they inflicted their own agenda on others. They harmed others ultimately in the name of their own self-interest. They valued their happiness above the happiness of others. But you might think there's a problem with this feature of Mill's ethics. What about parents and their children? Isn't part of being a good parent being partial toward the happiness of your child? If you're deciding whether, for instance, to take your child to the zoo or to donate that time to a local homeless shelter, are you doing something immoral by favoring taking your kid to the zoo? Imagine that helping the homeless at the homeless shelter would have a greater net impact on happiness. Your child would be a little bit happier, but more people at the homeless shelter would be made happy. What do you think about this objection? Do you think it works? Or can Mill's utilitarianism capture why it's morally okay to sometimes be partial toward yourself or your own family? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Idea number 3, motives are irrelevant to an action's morality. Deontology, or duty-based ethics, is the biggest rival to consequentialism. A deontological theory like Kantian ethics focuses on whether actions align with moral imperatives. Your duty is to perform the action that aligns with the moral law, and your action only has moral worth when you perform it from a sense of duty or out of respect for the moral law. Your intentions matter morally. For utilitarianism, your intentions are irrelevant. Mill thinks we often act from mixed motives. Motives might determine whether a person is a good or bad person, but motives do not determine whether the act the person performs is morally right. You can do the right thing from the wrong motives. If I judge that I must save a person who's drowning because I see that the person is a rich person I know, then my motive is a big cash reward from saving them. Though I saved the person from a motive that reflects poorly on me, I still perform the morally right action. So being motivated to do your duty for Mill doesn't make the action have greater moral value or worth. Idea number 4 is that morality doesn't require huge self-sacrifice. Now, this idea from Mill comes as a response to an objection to utilitarianism, namely that it's too demanding. If the point of morality is happiness and right actions maximize net happiness, then living a moral life appears to require great sacrifice or being saintly. It's like immoral to, spend money on my dog when that same money could save a person's life. Utilitarianism may require huge self-sacrifice in the name of promoting the greater good. Now, Mill responds by saying that individuals aren't required by utilitarianism to make huge self-sacrifices. Most people aren't in the position to make large-scale impact through being generous. People like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, they have the resources, the cash money to make a large difference in minimizing suffering around the globe, so they're obligated to do so. But small potatoes like me and probably you don't have such resources, so we're not required to do the same. It is not morally wrong for me to buy my dog a toy instead of donating that money to charity. Idea number 5, utilitarianism isn't necessarily a godless theory of ethics. This last idea is a bit shocking when you think about utilitarianism. You might think it's contemporary utilitarians like Peter Singer. He's an atheist. Utilitarianism seems to take God out of the picture. Ultimate moral intrinsic value isn't found in God's commands, divine law as revealed in scripture, or any other religious thing. Instead, the capacity to experience pain and pleasure, sentience, is the foundation for the ultimate thing of moral value, namely happiness. And maximizing that is what makes acts morally right. There's no need for God, or so it seems. Why does he say that utilitarianism and God aren't mutually incompatible as a foundation for morality? Well, Mill thinks whether the existence of God is compatible with utilitarianism or not depends on your view of God. If you think God's ultimate desires for people is that they be happy, then utilitarianism isn't necessarily godless. God's will for humanity is compatible with the principle of utility. God's commands things because they're good, because they ultimately lead his creatures to happiness and away from pain and suffering. If you're a divine command theorist and you think things are morally good simply because God commands them, then your view of God is incompatible with utilitarianism. On such a view, God might command people to commit genocide, which inflicts a massive amount of pain and suffering on people, and such an act would be morally good just because God commanded it. What do you think about this idea from Mill that utilitarianism is not necessarily a godless doctrine? It just matters how you view God. Do you find it plausible? Leave your thoughts.
Anyway, so it's worth pointing out, I mean, there is this, there were a lot of people for a long time who sort of just answered ethical questions that way, and it just doesn't work in them. It just doesn't work philosophically, as we sort of heard earlier, because if you ask someone for religious doctrines about right and wrong, they are going to give you contradictory ones at times. And so if you can't come up with a generalizable theory, if that's the thing you start with, the theory has to be generalizable, and you have to take that somewhere else. So this is most modern thinkers are following Kant in seeing those as very, very separate things, and they only get in trouble if you try and mix them. While I'm here, though, on background, Jeremy Bentham is kind of a curious character. So Bentham and Mill, the older, were friends, and Bentham was a very wealthy man, and he had this curious idea that he should use his money for good when he died, and so he gave it to one of the colleges. I think it's part of Cambridge, I believe, and he stipulated in his will that that when he died, they would preserve his body, and at least twice a year during members' meetings of the Board of Trustees, they would bring his body to the meeting room so that his presence and stern countenance would be there as they made decisions about what to do with his money. So he's still there. He's in London in a box, sitting there in a closet, and twice a year they have to wheel him out for these Board of Trustee meetings. Now, something bad happened when they were preserving him, and the mummification process didn't work very well on his head. And so the head unfortunately decayed, but they did keep the head, and they keep it in a jar, and they keep it under the chair here that he's sitting on. But the people at Madame Tussauds Wax Museum made him a wax head. So yes. So his stern countenance now is artificially generated, but that's Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham, such a good. Okay, so Bentham and James Mill. Now, so James Mill is already an important philosopher and active in British politics. He was a member of Parliament, and when he had a son, James and Jeremy decided that young John needed to be properly educated, and so these two, the greatest philosophers in England, decided they were going to raise this child. By the time little John was 6 years old, he was fluent in Latin and Greek, as well as English and French and German. 6 years old. By the time he was 18, he had a mental breakdown and spent a year in an institution. Somehow is also not surprising. Along in between, when he was, I think that was when he was 19. When he was 18, he got arrested for distributing flyers in a poor part of London with information about birth control, because information about birth control was illegal at the time. His father happened to be a member of Parliament, so they arrested him, but they let him go. So anyway, so John Stuart Mill does manage to eclipse his father's greatness as a philosopher. So in that way, his father was successful, but he does seem to have, this educational program seems to have had some consequences for little John along the way. but he does also seem to have recovered from them. So John Mill also was elected to Parliament, but I think he'd only served one term, or his father served multiple terms in Parliament. Okay, so this utilitarianism thing, going forward, the newer and newer utilitarians are going to come back, and they're actually going to go back to Bentham on this can we rank pleasures question, and so modern thinking tends to argue that it's really difficult to measure pleasures, but there is a sense in which Mill has a point that when you're talking about pleasures that contribute to your growth, your long-term growth and development, that's something that's likely to have payoff down the road. And so in that way, the pleasure you get from doing research or from sharpening your mind, playing a game of chess, is going to be superior to the pleasure you get from eating a donut, because that pleasure is very short-lived. But the pleasure from the chess and developing your skills and developing your mind, those are things that you'll come back to over and over again through the course of your life. So there's an argument to be made that there might be some ways of getting a hierarchy of pleasures for an individual, but it becomes difficult to argue when you want to project that out onto the world, that you can say that this kind of pleasure in one person is a higher pleasure than that kind of pleasure in another person. And that so at that level, you need to treat all people equally. And what we're going to see is when we get to people who are going to talk about animal rights, they're going to just sort of disregard the people thing and argue you need to treat experience all equally. And so that higher and lower pleasure thing becomes a complicated issue that anyway, will get dealt with in different ways by different people going forward, but it's generally going to be steering something back towards Bentham. There is I forget who coined it, but there's kind of a little dig at utilitarianism that comes in the phrase utilitarian calculus. The idea that, and this comes from Bentham, who actually I think ended up embracing the term. But the idea that if you're figuring out right and wrong, and what you're supposed to do is measure pleasure and pain in the world as a result of that, you have to do a lot of quick adding in your head. Okay, so if I do X, there's going to be this kind of pleasure that comes from it. There's going to be this kind of pain that comes from it. Now, is there more on the pain side or more on the pleasure side? And if there's more on the pleasure side, well, then that's the thing to do. If there's more on the pain side, then nope, don't do that. So lots of adding and comparing that goes on. So utilitarian calculus is, and of course, calculus is a scary word. That's why if people use that, make it sound scary. But so what a lot of modern utilitarians do, and this is my own thinking, is called rule utilitarianism. And the idea there is that you can work up a lot of rules of thumb ahead of time about things that are right and wrong. And those rules of thumb tend to look a lot like the things that Kant talks about. So the rule utilitarian says, okay, we'll come up with some rules of thumb. The Kantians are wonderful about rules, so we can even use some of their rules. And the ones that clearly are producing more pleasure than pain, those are the rules you hold on to. The ones that produce more pain than pleasure, those are the rules you put there to say no to. So there's this way in which in some modern ethics that the two systems are kind of blurring together. And what we find is very often, if you get a really hardcore Kantian thinker and a really hardcore utilitarian thinker and you ask them a question, they'll both give you the same answer. They'll just come up with a different story about why it's the right answer. So that also is kind of reassuring in a way that our ethical theories are competing, but they're not often competing about answers. They're most often competing about the methodology they're using to get to the answer, because the things that Kant rejects are generally things that cause hardship and pain. So that kind of makes sense. And in fact, on the deontological side, there are people, oh nuts, I'm forgetting his name. Oh, I almost had it. Anyway, that argue for a kind of short-term version of deontology that that says you have to figure out which principle you're going to apply in context, in context. Contextual ethics, I think that's actually the name. I'm sorry, I have a little brain fog on this one. Anyway, so that approach is in essence, by saying it's that the principles are going to be contextual, you've gone a long way towards moving to a system in which you're measuring outcomes. And so which principle you're using, you might have to decide based on outcomes. And so that consequentialist ethics wants to use principles, but it's using principles in a way that's really immediate, like utilitarian ethics is immediate with experience. So that consequentialist ethics is like utilitarianism, and rule utilitarianism is kind of like deontological ethics. But again, when you push them on the why, they're going to have a different answer for why that's the thing I should do. Okay, so those are the big theories. We're going to do a little application here going forward. Any quick questions while we're here? Well, I don't have to be quick. Oh. Okay. I thought I had one more side note. Okay, anyway, well, let's move forward. So Peter Singer, interesting character, part of that baby boom generation. So he's known as a very radical advocate for utilitarian ethics, and he's argued a number of positions that sometimes attracts attention and protests from some people. And he's not afraid of controversy, so he will often even phrase things in the most provocative way because he knows it's provocative, and he does that. But he's been a very good articulator of the general thinking of what is utilitarianism, and because he's applied it in a lot of different areas, a lot of the modern thinkers that we run into, so the next two examples are going to be they're famous for very specific applied questions they work on, where Singer's well known for a work on a number of different applied questions, but always very strongly defended in a utilitarian framework. So for him, I actually have we get to hear a little bit of him and then some analysis of his thinking. What in the world's going on here? So this is him from some time back. So I think it's got to be more than 10. I think the recording's from 10 years ago. The video was created 10 years ago, but I think the film was actually probably 30 or 40 years old now.
If you told most Americans that by experimenting on a small group of islanders in a remote country in ways that would cause them some harm, we could cure cancer, they would say, yeah, go for it.
Selfishness is at the core of Singer's ethical thinking. He often lectures about this subject around the world, like here at Oxford University in England. He questions what is the responsibility of people living in luxury to help people mired in poverty. He outlines his view in his latest book called Writings on an Ethical Life, and he's come up with a provocative ethical scenario to illustrate it. He asks you to imagine that you have just invested most of your retirement money, as well as much of your pride, on an expensive automobile like this one.
You park your car on a railroad crossing to step out for a breath of fresh air. From out of the blue, a runaway train comes roaring towards your car. Now you can pull a switch, this one right here, to change the train track. But there's a refugee child from Bangladesh on that other track. So you have a choice. Save your precious car or save the child.
Peter Singer thinks most people would want to save the child, but by the way people live their everyday lives, they are choosing, in fact, to save their car.
We are so prepared to spend money on luxuries rather than give substantial.
Now, let me just sort of for added detail here. In this example, he specifically uses the example of a car called a Bugatti. Have you all heard of Bugatti? It's the most expensive production car in the world, and if you want one, you generally have to pay between $2 and $4 million. So that's what that's what he wants you to imagine. You have a $4 million car, and there's a child. $4 million car and a child. $4 million car, but it's a $4 million car.
Amounts to alleviating the kind of poverty that leads to the preventable death of so many people elsewhere in the world.
Singer used the example of the car and child in an article he wrote for the New York Times. It struck a chord with readers. Two charities mentioned in the piece, UNICEF and Oxfam, received donations of about $750,000 in response. Singer himself says he gives 20% of his income to charity. But ideally, he says, everyone should only keep money for basic necessities. The rest should be given away.
Tell me, in your opinion, what's ethically wrong with my saying, listen, I work hard for my money. I think I'm entitled not just to survive, but to enjoy. And if I want to spend $500 on a restaurant meal, well, okay.
I think what's ethically wrong with that attitude is that most of the world's population, no matter how hard they work for their entire life, would never even be able to get to the point of spending $50 on a restaurant meal. And I think that ought to come above your, let me say, somewhat frivolous desire to go to a restaurant that requires you to spend $500.
You live in at least a reasonably nice apartment, and you don't skip your trips back home to Australia.
True.
Is that, or is it not, prima facie evidence that you don't exactly practice what you preach?
It's prima facie evidence, and I accept it. I don't live up fully to my ideals. I acknowledge that I should go further, but I wish that there were more people following me as far as I've gone, and then maybe it would be a little easier to keep going down that track.
Easier, perhaps, but no less challenging for Singer or for the rest of us. Medical miracles are bringing new ethical choices along with new cures, heartbreaking decisions along with life-saving treatments. The rules, it seems, are changing, but Peter Singer says he is guided by one of the oldest rules of all.
My ethics come from considering the consequences of my actions for all of those who get affected by them. I'm prepared to say that in a sense, my ethics is a kind of golden rule. The idea of saying, how would you like it if this were done to you, is fundamental to my sense of ethics, because I think that's what ethics is about. It's about getting beyond yourself and looking at the effect that you're having on others.
Now, and that's a generally, generally every theorist in ethics will say that what makes ethics ethics is that it's something that's universalizable, that if you're not doing that, you're not doing ethics, you're doing something else. So, okay. You guys have any thoughts about that? Now here, I guess what you might notice that's standing out is that Singer, in some ways, seems like there is a critique of Mill in here, in which Singer seems would I've not heard him say this, but I'm just saying it seems like he could or would in some context say that Mill's clearly an elitist. And Singer would be disappointed with some of the decisions that Mill made because Mill does have these sort of elitist attitudes, like about the higher pleasures bit. So, that Mill should have been, you know, spending a lot more of his, giving a lot more of his money to charity and those kinds of things. So Singer is a much more challenging theorist in that way than Mill is. Mill's trying to make utilitarianism a little easier, since Bentham made it hard, and then Mill makes it a little easier, and Singer's making it harder again, more demanding on our behavior. How are we doing? Uh-oh, running low on time. Okay. Okay, so on the subject of trains, there might be something you've heard of in philosophy that's called the trolley problem. So the trolley problem was created by a woman named Philippa Foot, very important American philosopher. And what she says is, imagine that you are, there are a number of versions of it, sorry, but I think the first version is going to be the one with the fat guy on the no, it's the switch. Okay, so imagine you're at a switch like Dan Rather was. You're sort of in the rail yard. There's a switch, and from your perspective, you can see that there's this trolley coming, and the track that it's on, there are 5 guys down the track around a corner working, and you know that if the trolley keeps going the way it's going to hit these 5 guys, these 5 workers, it's going to kill them. Well, you could flip the switch, and if you did, it goes on a different track, and there's one person working on that track. So what do you do? Now, this is meant to be an illustration of how utilitarian ethics works. This is sort of her defense of it, is that you can't, if your principle here is you shouldn't hurt people, you're in a lot of trouble because someone's going to get hurt. So what she's saying is clearly the right thing to do is that it's at least abstractly, with knowing nothing else, it is better for one person to die than for 5 people to die. And if that's all you know, then your decision should be obvious to you. But it doesn't make it an easy decision. So anyway, so there are various iterations on this problem. The term trolley problem for this particular problem was that name was coined by Judith Jarvis Thomson. And I should point out in the syllabus that I sent out at the beginning of class, I made the very common mistake of spelling her name Thompson with a P. It is in fact Thomson with no P. So I apologize for that, but just so you know, it's Thomson. Okay, so Thomson is very famous for, again, the right analogy at the right time. It's all about the right analogy with philosophy. Remember that. And with hers, what she comes up with is what we now call the famous violinist problem. And it's significant. It's you know in the air today because with all the news about abortion and abortion rights. Thomson actually published this a year or so before the Supreme Court made its decision in 1973, and there are a lot of people who think that the paper that she wrote was a major factor in the court moving the way it did because she just phrased the problem in such a way that the answer needed to be yes, we're going to have to side with autonomy. Anyway, but here I'll show you what it looks like. Oop.
Presents Thomson, A Defense of Abortion. The debate over abortion, whether you're speaking from a legal, religious, or moral perspective, is far from new. A large chunk of the arguments center around whether the fetus is considered a person and what rights that person has in comparison to the rights of the woman carrying the child. Pro-lifers tend to argue that a person is a person from the moment of conception, and thus a fetus has a right to life. Judith Jarvis Thomson argued back in the 1970s that such reasoning doesn't actually settle the debate. Even if it's assumed for the sake of argument that a fetus is a person from moment of conception, nothing is proved on whether or not abortion is permissible. Rather, one would have to show that this person's right to life outweighs.
Now, here it's worth noting that, yes, philosophy is generally going to agree with principles about protecting life, but what's being noticed is that we also occasionally take life, and there are reasons for that. And so to argue that violence or killing people is always wrong is sort of a non-starter, except for, you know, certain absolutists. But even then it's more complicated because who's living and who's dying, you know. I mean, it's so this is why she's starting with this very it's to philosophers very obvious but complicated fact that sometimes you are making decisions about who's living and who's dying. That's what the trolley problem is about.
Both the mother's autonomy over her body and her own right to life. Thompson attempts to see if it does in her article, A Defense of Abortion. Granted that the fetus is a person, the extremist pro-life view would state that abortion is thus never permissible because the baby has a right to life. However, this view fails to take into account the pregnant woman's perspective. In the case where pregnancy directly threatens the mother's life, must we insist that she has to passively wait for death? Thompson argues that most people would say no. Furthermore, to always argue for the carrying of the baby to term would be completely ignoring the woman's right to life and, in essence, stating that the fetus's life is of a higher value than hers. The argument over abortion, according to Thompson, routinely ignores the woman's perspective. Instead, it is debated whether a third party should be permitted to perform abortions. Thompson proposes that while a third person is within their right to object to intervene, they cannot prevent the woman from acting. Thompson explains this via the expanding child. Say that you're trapped in a tiny house with a rapidly expanding child. If nothing is done, you will be crushed to death in a matter of minutes. The child, on the other hand, will be fine. He'll be hurt, but in the end, he'll burst out the door a free man. While a third person outside the house can refuse to choose between you and the child, both innocent parties, this doesn't mean you can't act in self-defense and attack the child to save your own life. This hypothetical isn't much different from fatal pregnancies, Thompson argues. To prevent a woman from getting a life-saving abortion would be to insist she wait passively for death within her own home. The right to life allegedly prohibits abortion, yet the term is never defined. Thompson proposes two common definitions for right to life. One, that a person be given, at the very least, the bare necessities needed to survive, or two, that it is impermissible to kill a person. However, both these functional meanings break down upon closer inspection. It's easy to find holes in the second definition. Most would amend the statement by clarifying that one should not unjustly kill another. However, there's also a flaw with insisting that a person.
And actually, this is the language that's used in the Bible, in the Ten Commandments. The commandment is not do not kill. The commandment is do not murder, where murder is defined as unjust killing. So it's even biblical that do not murder. It's not do not kill.
Right to life entitles them to whatever they need to survive, namely one that entitles them to something they do not have the right to. For example, let's say that I am terminally ill, and the only thing that can save me from death is the touch of President Barack Obama's hand upon my brow. While it would be nice of him to do so, no one would argue that I have a right to have President Obama flow into my hospital room to bestow upon me his healing touch. Likewise, Thompson argues no one can have a right to someone else's body unless they are freely given that right by said individual. Therefore, abortion would be permissible in cases where the pregnancy would be fatal or the woman did not voluntarily grant the fetus the use of her body. However, just because abortion is permissible in these cases does not mean that it's permissible in every case. Thompson's article is still relevant as the debate over abortion continues. Her paper is remembered and cited today because of her vivid and succinct comparisons and hypotheticals used to make her points. Furthermore, she brought attention to a previously ignored logical gap. Abortion is discussed not only morally, but legally as well. As Thompson points out, excluding actively harming another, the United States has no law insisting that people be minimally decent to each other. For example, 38 people witnessed Kitty Genevieve's murder, yet they did nothing, not even call the police, and they faced no legal punishment for their inaction. Yet, criminalizing abortion forces women to not only be minimally decent, but good Samaritans. Thompson brings up this point to show the disconnect and gross injustice she sees in current law. It's worth noting that, rather than give a simple conclusion that abortion is either always wrong or always permissible, she gives a nuanced answer. In her words, there may well be cases in which carrying the child to term requires only minimally decent Samaritanism of the mother, and this is a standard we must not fall below. Furthermore, while abortion can be permissible, Thompson does not argue that the mother has a right to kill the unborn child. While removing the fetus from the woman's body means death for the fetus, equating the right of removal with the right to kill is a mistake. If, by some miracle, the fetus lives, or if it ever becomes possible to remove fetuses alive from pregnant women via scientific advancement, it should be granted the opportunity to live. Now it's your turn to think further.
Okay, I love that. I love this one. This is actually the best video that I found about the thinking in her argumentation. But it didn't tell us about the actual analogy, which was its shortcoming. So I have to do that. What the analogy that she came up with is she says, imagine that you're asleep at home one night, and for various complicated reasons, the world's most famous violinist has fallen ill, and it happens that you are an exact tissue type match, and so in order to save this world's most famous violinist's life, that the violinist needs to be hooked up to you so that your body can do bodily functions for the violinist for some period of time. And that's all she needs. It's just, okay, so imagine that scenario. You wake up and here you are. World's most famous violinist is in bed with you and you're not going anywhere for quite some time now. And it's what this is the analogy she's using to point up about the autonomy that we don't expect. It is not in ordinary life, we don't expect people to do those kinds of things. Now, there's some curious points about the argument that are worth noting. One is she's constructed the argument in deontological terms. The argument is arguing about principles. She is one of the world's most foremost utilitarian thinkers. And so it's really interesting that when she wrote this, that to make the argument, she realized the people she's arguing with are generally not utilitarians. And so if she's going to offer a defense, because that's the name of the paper, then that defense has to engage them in the terms they use. And so she makes the argument entirely in deontological terms. It's all about principles and which principles you're following where, which is a really clever move as a matter of argumentation, she's recognizing that my way of thinking isn't making headroom. I have to think about it in the ways that they think about it. And so she comes up with these ways of doing it with principles, which that's really impressive, I think, just in terms of just sort of creativity of thinking as of a philosopher, sort of to recognize that how am I going to go about making the right argument here? And then she's figuring this out, that it's not about my theory, it's about their theory. So very impressive, very impressive. She died in 2020, 20 years older than Singer. So she was fairly old at the time. So that's not she lived a long life. Any quick questions before we go on to Tom Reagan, before I run out of time here? I feel like I'm going really fast today, but we did have a bunch of people. Okay. Let's do Tom Reagan. Now, this one actually is Reagan talking. What's interesting, what I want to point out ahead of time is that Reagan is a Kantian. So he's going to make a deontological argument, and it's going to have to be a different argument than Kant, because Kant's argument centers very much on people thinking and reasoning people. So he has a different argument, but it's going to be principle based, so it's Kantian, it's deontological. Singer is probably the most famous philosopher who argues for animal rights, but right, he's doing it with this very overt utilitarian thing. So for Reagan, it's going to be about rights. For Singer, it's going to be about suffering. And for Singer, that's just sort of straightforward. That's unjustifiable suffering, is wrong. End of story. Reagan's has this much more sort of nuanced argument about why there are important principles at stake and what those principles are and how we should go about following them. But again, sort of good example of two philosophers, very different theoretical starting points in the ethics, but they are ending up in exactly the same place, that they're both arguing for that we should all be vegetarian.
The other animals humans eat, use in science, hunt, trap, and exploit in a variety of other ways have a life of their own that is of importance to them apart from their utility to us. They are not only in the world, they are aware of it and also of what happens to them. And what happens to them matters to them. Each has a life that fares experientially better or worse for the one whose life it is. Like us, they bring a unified psychological presence to the world. Like us, they are some bodies, not some things. In these fundamental ways,
they are some bodies, not some things. Really, there is the move. That's all he needs, really, is he's taken Kant and gone, we're going to make Kant bigger.
Non-human animals in labs and on farms, for example, are the same as human beings. And so it is that the ethics of our dealings with them and with one another must rest on some of the same fundamental moral principles. At its deepest level, an enlightened human ethic is based on the independent value of the individual. To treat human beings in ways that do not honor their independent worth, to reduce them to the status of tools or models or commodities, for example, is to violate that most basic of human rights, the right to be treated with respect. The philosophy of animal rights demands only that logic be respected, for any argument that plausibly explains the independent value of human beings implies that other animals have the same value and have it equally. And any argument that plausibly explains the right of humans to be treated with respect also implies that these other animals have this same right and have it equally also. As a result of selective media coverage in the past, to which this evening's debate is a notable and praiseworthy exception, the general public has tended to view advocates of animal rights in exclusively negative terms. We are anti-intellectual, anti-science, anti-rational, anti-human. We stand against justice and for violence. The truth, as it happens, is quite the reverse. The philosophy of animal rights is on the side of reason, for it is not rational to discriminate arbitrarily. And discrimination against non-human animals is demonstrably arbitrary. It is wrong to treat weaker human beings, especially those who are lacking in normal human intelligence, as tools or models, for example. It cannot be rational, therefore, to treat other animals as if they were tools, models, and the like, if their psychology is as rich as or richer than these human beings. The philosophy of animal rights is pro, not anti-science. This philosophy is respectful of our best science in general and of evolutionary biology in particular. The latter teaches that, in Darwin's words, humans differ from many other animals in degree and not in kind. Questions about line drawing to one side, it is obvious that the animals used in laboratories, raised for food, and hunted for pleasure or trapped for profit, for example, are our psychological kin. This is not fantasy. This is fact, supported by our best science. The philosophy of animal rights stands for, not against, justice. We are not to violate the rights of the few so that the many might benefit. Slavery allows this. Child labor allows this. All unjust social institutions allow this, but not the philosophy of animal rights, whose highest principle is that of justice. The philosophy of animal rights stands for peace and against violence. The fundamental demand of this philosophy is to treat humans and other animals with respect. This philosophy, therefore, is a philosophy of peace, but it is a philosophy that extends the demand for peace beyond the boundaries of our species. For there is an undeclared war being waged every day against countless millions of non-human animals. To stand truly for peace is to stand firmly against their ruthless exploitation. And what, aside from the common menu of media distortions, what will be said by the opponents of animal rights? Will the objection be that we are equating animals and humans in every respect, when in fact humans and animals differ greatly? But clearly we are not. Saying that humans and other animals are the same in every way, that dogs and cats can do calculus, or that pigs and cows enjoy poetry. What we are saying is that, like humans, many other animals have an experiential welfare of their own. In this sense, we and they are the same. In this sense, therefore, despite our many differences, we and they are equal. Will the objection be that we are saying that every human and every animal has the same rights, that chickens should have the right to vote, and pigs the right to ballet lessons? But of course, we are not saying this. All we are saying is that these animals and humans share one basic moral right, the right to be treated with respect. Will the objection be that because animals do not respect our rights, we therefore have no obligation to respect their rights either? But there are many human beings who have rights and are unable to respect the rights of others. Young children and the mentally enfeebled and deranged of all ages. In their case, we do not say that it is perfectly all right to treat them as tools or models or commodities because they do not honor our rights. On the contrary, we recognize that we have a duty to treat them with respect. What is true of cases involving these human beings is no less true of cases involving other animals. Will the objection be that if other animals do have more, even if other animals do have moral rights, there are other more important things that need our attention? World hunger and child abuse, for example, apartheid, drugs, violence to women, the plight of the homeless. After we take care of these problems, then we can worry about animal rights. This objection misses the mark, for the rank and file of the animal rights movement is composed of people whose first line of service is human service. Doctors, nurses, and other healthcare professionals, people involved in a broad range of social services, from rape counseling to aiding victims of child abuse or famine or discrimination, teachers at every level of education, ministers, priests, rabbis. As the lives of these people demonstrate,
Dr. Reagan, could you do your best to bring your remarks to a
the
close?
choice thoughtful people face is not between either helping humans or helping other animals. One can do both. We should do both. Is it rational, impartial, scientifically informed? Does it stand for peace and against injustice? To all these questions, the answer is an unqualified yes. And as for the objections that are raised against this philosophy, are those who accept it able to offer rational, informed answers? Again, the answer is yes. In the battle of ideas, the philosophy of animal rights wins, its critics lose. It remains to be seen which side emerges as the victor in the ongoing political battle between what is just and what is not.
Okay. He's brilliant. He was brilliant. Very compelling speaker too, as you saw. Okay, just a couple minutes. Any questions, any thoughts? Just quick run through ethics. No? Uh-huh.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
I would like to ask, he showed some really cute pictures of sheep and baby animals and stuff that would not even be alive if people they would have no life at all. So that would be preferable to him, that they would have no life at all.
Then yeah. Now it's interesting, what's the principle there? Not sure, but it's because that seems like a very utilitarian thought. But
on my part,
No, well, no, I mean, just my answer is a utilitarian answer, right? Well, how does he go about navigating that question? And it seems like it's a utilitarian answer. Well, it's better not to be than if life is only suffering, then it's better not to live. That's a very obvious.
But they clearly were not suffering. They were gambling about.
Well, no, right, no. But your question was, should they exist at all?
Yeah.
No, if they exist only to suffer, then no. So. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, I mean, because see, the question, the deeper, I think the deeper, more principled answer he would make is that there is no principle that demands that we produce extra creatures in the world. There's no, I mean, we can have fewer creatures in the world. That's not an ethical problem. So I think that might be the principled answer he'd give you.
Right, because we rendered them helpless. You know,
right, over time by creating them domestically. Yeah.
Right. Originally, they could survive on their own, and then we took them in.
Yeah. So yeah. So it's entirely on us whether their lives are good or bad, and yeah.
This concept of being the subject of a life is pretty cool. He says. The fact that each of us has a life that matters to us. Mm-hmm. In other words, what happens to us matters to us. It's almost like that's a value. That's a thing to be, or a situation to be valued. That there is this subject of a life that has all these characteristics. We perceive things, we feel, we have consciousness, blah blah. That is a valued thing, valued commodity, whatever situation.
Yeah, it's sort of like, you know, what it's ethics is sort of, ethics is in a sense a kind of circle, right? What's in the circle and what's out of the circle. And the animal rights people are saying, well, animals have to be in the circle too. Now, Kant defined the circle that included people, but didn't include animals. And so what Reagan has done is give us a different definition so that Kant's own circle now includes the animals too.
Yeah. So without these conscious beings that are subject of a life, everything would just be things, and you wouldn't have any ethics. There'd be no right or wrong.
Yeah, there'd be no right or wrong.
No.
It has to matter to something.
Yeah.
One way or another.
Yeah.
And then you could see how the environment could also be included in that circle.
Okay, so. Yeah, actually, there's a guy named Aldo Leopold who's getting a little more attention these days. He had an important book in the 50s. He worked for the Forest Service and wrote this book called The Land Ethic, in which he constructs a really interesting utilitarian argument in which he's arguing that we need to include natural systems in that circle. And it's the same kind of thing, right? You know, there's a lot of utilitarian arguments to make about why we need to protect the environment, but Leopold is really interesting because he makes the Kantian argument that we should be protecting the argument because the natural system in a sense is analogous to having a life in which it's for itself, kind of existential language for itself. Since it is a being for itself, that's Sartre's language, foreshadowing next week. That's what gets it into the circle. So Aldo Leopold, another interesting character in ethics. Okay, well, that gets us to 12:30 then. I'll let you all go. So yeah, next week is going to be the existentialists. And I just gave you reference two readings for you, but we'll also talk about some other people, including some of the precursors to existentialism. That'll be Heidegger and Husserl, and we'll also talk about Camus, who's really important, famous existentialist. So it'll be a little bit broader than just those two people for next week. Existentialism. Who am I and what am I to be? Okay, have a good week. I'll stop the recording.